but it does not stop necessarily the traffic congestion. Business needs to go forward. You need to be able to deliver going forward. That you can only do if you do specific investigations as well. The discovery phase is very much around the aspect of where did we have the issue? Where have we been impacted around the globe? How do we make sure that our supply chain still is in place? And the incident response is really around the aspects of try to minimize the potential impact on you as a business at the end of the day. These areas are fundamental. If you don't have specific incident management phases, incident management plans in place, I guarantee you, if you have a major cyber attack, you're going to fail. You're going to fail massively. It costs you a lot of money. So I urge you to stress test yourself. I urge you to have your board stress tested or work with your board specifically. I do this often. I often work with boards around the world, and some of the boards say, well, nothing can happen to us until they get exposed suddenly, you know. You sometimes have to show them how data flows out of the company. And, you know, the discussion is always around the aspect of, should we pay a ransom fee? Yes or no? Let me ask you a question. You would be asked as a company to pay $100. And after paying $100, you get access to your systems back. Who would pay? Who wouldn't pay? Who wouldn't pay? Hand up. Anyone would not pay? Just one would not pay. Everybody else would pay. Okay. Normally I get the opposite as a response. But let me be very clear. It's not black or white whether you pay or not pay. It depends on the individual circumstances as a company, the stage of your company. Is it a startup company? What is at risk? Is it intellectual property, which is depending to you? Is it decisive data, for instances? This is really highly. Or might it be lives which are at risk, right? Give you a typical example. A couple of months ago, one major case happened. And at the end, this particular case, I cannot tell you which company it was, but it was a hospital which was impacted as well. And it was an attack specifically on a company, and that attack was indirect, okay? So they attacked one company, and if the company wouldn't have paid specifically, the hospital wouldn't have had any kind of specific utility support, which means there wouldn't have been energy. That was one of the traps. The other traps was there was simultaneously happening another attack against the hospital. So people were asked, obviously, around the aspects, why did they pay? Quite simple. If they wouldn't have paid, many people would have died at the end of the day. So what I want to say with this, many of these attacks we're seeing around the world at the moment, they're fully criminal. There's criminal intention behind it. And criminal intention behind it means destruction. And often if you pay, however, it doesn't mean you automatically get your key back. You might not get your key back. Part of your data might be destroyed on the other side, or in the worst case, you get a new bug on your PC or on your system at the end of the day. So in a nutshell, sometimes you have no other choice to pay because either your company is at risk, third-party lives are at risk, your reputation might be at risk. I recently had a case with a law firm, specifically, we run such a simulation, and the law firm particularly, you know, we stressed that at the company, and I said, would you ever pay to such intruders? The answer was, never ever, we don't negotiate with criminals. Right? You don't negotiate with criminals. What's the biggest asset of a law firm? It's reputation or not? It's client data or not? So if the client data is going out of a law firm, flowing out, there must come a certain point when people will say, we'd rather pay or not. So suddenly somebody said, yes, we have to pay, we have no other choice. But you know what then can happen? You pay and you get a new message which might say proudly supporting Al-Qaeda on your website. What are you going to do then? Crisis management, crisis management. So you cannot do that if you have not stress tested these situations. You need to stress test it. Because as I said, it's not about if it's going to happen, it's about when it's going to happen. Impacts on management particularly, and I think this is a very important slide for anyone who's feeding back to top management. It's not about incident triage, it's not about what's happening to a company, it's about your top management needs to be in the position actually to ring fence the situation. So they will be very occupied, and if they are not involved from the beginning in the stress test specifically of such situations, how do they want to respond? They're going to run around like headless chicken at the end of the day. Let's look briefly about what really happened to this company. So I changed this number slightly. It's still a 7-digit number, a material 7-digit number. But what it showed to you was really specifically that such a cyber attack can have catastrophic implications on any company at the end of the day. We're talking here about 5 days shutdown, supply chain up to 7 days. Now I'd like to make this a little bit broader, talking about Asia. I recently concluded a specific analysis in Singapore, and this analysis was driven around a more catastrophic scenario than this one. It was driven around a major denial of service attack, distributed denial of service attack, backed by what I showed you here. And we looked at numerous sectors around the world, and we looked at the specific economic consequences for 3 scenarios. The first scenario was a major cloud failure. The second one was so-called domain network service failure. So you can't access websites anymore. And the third one was very much around power outage. The number for power outage as an economic loss around the world was roughly 120 billion. The number for denial of service attacks and cloud was roughly around 170 to 180 billion economic loss. Economic loss means the hit to your company, the cost to your company, including potential reputational cost. And the combination of the 3, let's assume you don't have any electricity anymore. You can't access your domain. You can't access your cloud provider. If we're talking about such a case, then we're talking about 240 billion. It's a lot of money at the end of the day. Now, how much do you believe out of this is roughly situated in Asia? I can tell you 60% of the potential loss is still situated in North America. Assuming any Asian, North American allocated companies are being consolidated headquarter-wise. But Asia in itself already represents today 20% of such a loss. So in the worst case, we're talking about 50 billion economic loss. That's a lot of money. Now, insurance plays a role. We'll talk briefly afterwards about it. In the worst case of an economic loss of 240 billion, we talk about a 40 billion insurance loss at the end. So what can be done? And handing over to Nigel briefly on this particular one as well. What were the lessons learned? Fundamentally, you have 4 pillars which you need to take into account when you talk to your management, when you talk to specifically to your peers. It's about crisis management. As I said, you cannot run into such a crisis without having done some preparation. You're going to be lost. Or like the English would say, you will be pulled apart at the end of the day. You're going to be toast. The second one is the incident response. You need to have people who can help you if such an attack is happening. And these people must have a track record. So you must stress test them across all the lines. The third one is the forensics. Forensics is absolutely decisive because it requires, obviously, engagement with the government. It requires engagement with your customers. It requires engagement across the top management. And last but not least, a topic which many people always forget is the good old insurance. Cyber insurance can add value. I will talk about that in a minute.
Thank you. When I get my microphone. Thank you. No, we're still not there. Try another one. We're good? Okay, thank you. Some really good points there. I'm going to recap a little bit about that along the way and hit on these last really important points. And so when we look at sort of what we've just gone through, there's some really key things that have come out in my thinking along the ways. Firstly, there's a whole range of different threats out there. Some of them are more serious than the other, but the threats nonetheless against, for those that are doing a startup, they're a threat to that. To those that are a regulator, they're a threat to the businesses that you regulate and everyone in between wherever you are in the banking and finance sector. Goes to say it is the main sector that people like hitting. I'm going to give a couple of examples, and these are public examples from Australia, so I can talk quite freely about them because they're all in the press. In the last 6 weeks in Australia, the state of Victoria, there was a spear phishing attack. That's where you get, well, in this instance, it was an email directly to a person, getting them to click on a link. In this case, it was a form, and it had a macro in that form that had malicious software in it. One person clicked on that link and took out 27 hospitals in Victoria. So when we start talking about these 4 points here, it is so big that they cannot cope. There is not enough people to do incident response. There is not enough forensic people around to image computers, look at attribution, get the things back going. It's all in the papers. You can read about it. It's a bit of an ongoing saga, but it's a really interesting one. Another one, when we start looking at reputation, there's a company, a property valuation company in Australia called Landmark White. And what happens with Landmark White, you go to the bank to get a mortgage, they'd send out Landmark White and they would value your house, your unit, your whatever you're borrowing money against and say, this is what we actually think it's worth. And the bank would take that for the mortgage. Now, they got hacked. They had 140,000 customer details revealed on the dark web. In interest of time, I won't take you through the timeline, but they were notified several times along the way that all this customer data was on the dark web, and they did nothing because they'd never rehearsed any of this. They didn't know what to do. So what happened? Their share price, they were listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. Before it happened, their share price was 48.5 cents per share. When the government finally told them to do something and tell the market, and we have notification laws in Australia, not as rigorous as the GDPR in Europe, but we have them nonetheless. So when they notified the market, their shares went from 48.5 cents to 38.5 cents within a day. They then suspended trading for the maximum allowable time, which in Australia is 6 weeks. Their shares came back on, and this is earlier this year, by the way. This is a 2019 case study. Their shares came back on, they dropped another 10 cents, and so we're now down at 27.5 cents. As of today, they're about 8 cents their shares. So if you're wondering, going back to Peter's point about saying this is a board issue, what happened with the board? The chair went, another non-executive director went, the CEO went, the chief information officer went. So there is some lessons to be learned from a company that if you'd gone in there the week before and said, I think we should stress test, as Peter said, I think we should go through this scenario, they'd be saying, it's all right, we won't get hacked. And I can tell you from a lot of experience, everyone that gets hacked will tell you the week before they're not going to get hacked. Same with the most basic scams like business email compromise, which is probably the #1 low-level criminal activity online in Australia by a country mile. And that's basically where you have a dodgy email, and a lot of it is pretty dodgy looking, different domains. There's lots of different ways that this all happens. But remembering it's very easy to register global domains now. So you might have a company called XYZ, and you might be xyz.com. It's very easy to go to Colombia and register xyz.co. And probably, I'm not sure about the .ph range, how easy it is to get a .ph domain, but it's getting more and more easier. It's very easy in Australia to get them too. We won't go into that. So very simple to do. So a couple of quick examples there of recent matters in Australia which have had lasting impact to shareholder value. The one last one I'll finish with before we go back to the slides, the Australian National University, again, heavily in the press this. It was a spear phishing attack on a senior executive in the organisation. And again, going back to why this matters for senior executives and board members, they're the ones invariably that are spear phished. So when we start looking at the education piece, we need to start educating not just the senior managers, but their executive assistants who often read their email beforehand. And they can often filter these things out. They're the people invariably have some variation of administrative privileges to the organisation. They can do things. So anyway, they got spear phished. There's been no attribution, but a foreign government is what they're calling, has got access to the ANU. They were in there. Goes back to what Peter said earlier, 500 and how many days for Asia?
525.
Yeah, I think for the ANU one, they were in about the 2 to 220 day mark. And again, you can read this report. It's all available. And the attackers these days, the reason that often it takes so long for detection is that they'll just sit there and be silent. Once they get in there, and before they start laterally moving around the network to look for any crown jewels, is they'll just sit there silent. And when we go back to the ransomware, a lot of you might be thinking, well, we've got backups. When we're going through the scenario before, who'd pay, who wouldn't? The latest variants of all the criminals, when you do your daily backup, your hourly backup, your weekly backup, your monthly backup, whatever it might be, that's already encrypted, and you think I've got this fresh backup. Or if you've got a hot backup, which is connected to the network, they'll just encrypt that as well. So lots to think about. But here's some really interesting points of going through this. Well, we'll call it a tabletop exercise So on my view of it all, the communications part, if we go from left to right, the crisis management, the communications part is going to be the really critical part. If you're a listed entity, firstly, or if you're a heavily regulated entity, what are you going to tell the market? If you're listed on the exchange, what are you going to tell the regulator? If you're a regulator in this room, what do you want to hear from the company that you're regulating? Have you told them through a policy piece or other advice that if you get hacked, we expect you to inform us this? We expect you to tell us how many customer data pieces were divulged. Who has access to it? Are they on the dark web? Were they emailed to someone else? Are they now subject to credit matters, with identity takeover, for example? Are you running a credit referencing monitoring service? Lots to go in the crisis management, because I can guarantee you from experience, and those few little examples, like the 3 examples I just gave, the media are all over this. They'll ask lots of questions. So preparation is the key for that. When I look at incident response and forensics, I kind of lump those a little bit together. That's when you need to call in the experts. You either have some in-house expertise, which invariably won't be enough unless you're a rather large bank or a rather large other organisation, but you're going to need external help. Your cyber insurance policy might cover that. It might cover some comms professionals. It might cover some incident response and technical people. You probably should check that. You probably should find out what the phone number of those people are and make conversation with them. Because you don't want to just have something like this happen and ring up consultancy X and then hope that they've got people that are available. So some things to think about how they're going to triage the network. If the network is down, how are you going to get it back up? If you're an e-commerce provider, you don't want to be down for more than 1 second because you're not accepting payments. So you've really got to think about this whole risk scenario. What does it mean to your business if you're offline? What's the reputational damage? What's the economic damage? What's the government damage? And I'm going to throw back to Peter to talk about the risk transfer, because I find cyber insurance to be, we're having a chat earlier about this, I find it quite a fascinating thing. spoken to a few organisations contemplating. It's still pretty nascent in Australia. It isn't well developed as a concept. And organisations are just dipping their toe in the water and trying to look at kind of what it means and what the premium should be and what do I get for that premium and how do they get to know me as an organisation. Well, you might want to explain.
Yeah, I mean, if we talk about cyber insurance today, I think the first thing which we should briefly discuss, if you would have to explain cyber to somebody on the street, how would you explain it? I can tell you, most people struggle to do that. Let me give a go specifically on it, the way I would do it. I always compare cyber really with burglary. And I always explain it the following way. I say, it's actually like burglary a house. But, you know, conventional burglary into a house, you take a hammer or you do it physically, right? But when you hack somebody, then what you do normally, you do it virtually, okay? But virtual access still is a way of either being malicious, wrongful, or you do it unauthorized because somebody let the door open at the end. So the way I explain cyber insurance in general is the following way. I say, okay, somebody goes through the roof of your house because he doesn't go through the front door, okay? He doesn't use a hammer. He uses a laptop, a computer system, a computer network. He actually enters the house either maliciously or unauthorized. He's not our guest, but he still gets in. Once he's in the house, what he really does, he goes from the roof into the various floors we have. And the first floor, we normally have some financial assets, okay? We have financial assets. So he steals financial assets. Or he interferes our revenues in the form of our supply chain. So that's first-party cyber at the end of the day. First-party cyber also includes stealing data at the end. Now, he goes a little further down where we also service our customers. So he uses our service and attacks somebody else with our service. So he uses a botnet. So he causes, at the end of the day, a liability. So that's network security liability. And what he also does, because my data, your data is on, he steals the data of us. We are individuals. So that's privacy at the end. And last but not least, because he doesn't like Nigel, he goes on the website and says, Nigel is supporting XYZ against government XYZ. And that's what is called internet liability at the end of the day. So that's cyber really, you know. Think about the following thing. Think always about virtual access. Think about a wrongful act, which is either malicious or unauthorized access for an omission. And think about the consequences. And the consequences are you lose revenues, you cause cost to yourself because you have to clean up the mess, you cause a liability because the third party claims against you, or at the end of the day, your reputation suffers. That's the way I explain it. But use it like a house, you know. It's much easier than trying to be very technical on it at the end of the day. So coming back on the risk transfer, maybe a couple of words about that, insurance, because people underestimate that. I've also done an analysis specifically on it. Today, the global insurance market for cyber insurance is roughly around $7 billion as a premium. It's predicted that by 2025, we'll have roughly $14 billion, and by 2030, around $30 billion. So exponential growth. Why is it exponential growth? Because what is the value today of a company? It's their intangible assets. What are intangible assets? Patents and data, particularly reputation. So the value of companies is shifting from, in the past, houses, machinery, content, over to data and intangible asset. So there's a huge demand for insurance. You could think there's a huge demand for insurance at the moment. Now, what's the take-up of cyber insurance at the moment? The take-up around the world is roughly, in the US, 30%, in Europe, 10%, in Asia, 3%, and in the rest of the world, 1%. Why is that the case? Three things. One is specifically uncertainty whether these contracts really pay out when it comes down to claim. The second one, I think the insurance market struggles to explain its value proposition because I think they need to get to grips with what cyber means for them as well. And the third one is nothing against, you know, jurisdictions, but in some jurisdictions, obviously, insurance means bad luck, as we know. You know, if you go into China, it means bad luck. So it's an expense to a certain degree, okay? But I always say the following, you know, in China there's a saying which is along the lines of, if you want to know what's going on, ask the children. And the children, what are they doing? They're playing games. They're going on internets. So they know how to hack people at the end of the day. And there's another saying which I think is very relevant to cyber risk. There's a famous boxer. You might have heard about it once. It's not many from the Philippines. Actually, it is Mike Tyson. And Mike Tyson once said, everyone knows to do until they get punched in the face. Once they get punched in the face, they don't know what to do. And this is really important when it comes down to cyber. If you are not stress testing situations, if you're not asking yourself, are you prepared in real times? And this doesn't mean, you know, playing card games or whatever and see this situation or that. You're going to fail. Out of my own experience working with boards,